Shaken to the Roots, 1965 through 1980, Chapter 29. Well, as you can see, since this is our last lecture, we're not going to get the last 30 years of our history. But I think you'll be more than willing to forego that to have the class finished. After 1965, a lot of your ethnic groups it just seemed like everything was going so slow. Maybe this integration thing is not going to work. Well, there's no good news from Vietnam. There's an oil crisis going on. There's a Watergate scandal. The public has totally lost any confidence they had in the government. So, well, poor LBJ. He really wanted out of Vietnam. He didn't even want to be in there in the first place. But as I said last week, he was the victim of bad advice. And he did add more military. His advisor said that military escalation would secure the Vietnam. And of course, General Westmoreland, who was in charge over there, I wish you could say, I should have put quotation marks around persuaded. He wore him down to the president to don't contain the U.S. involvement. We need to increase it. But they seem to forget they're not fighting a regular type army. They're fighting a guerrilla army at the Viet Cong. And no matter what you did, even though there was massive bombings, the Viet Cong had all kinds of networks of tunnels, and no matter what we did, we couldn't seem to get ahead. So the draft was increased. And boy, I do remember, unfortunately, every night on the news, whereas we hadn't seen dead American soldiers during World War II or Korea. Now not only do we see dead Viet Cong, dead villagers, we see dead American soldiers and even the wounded ones. It just makes you sick at your stomach. So the youth of our nation began picketing against the war, and they even had demonstrations. Even Martin Luther King is speaking out against the war. And we go from protesting nonviolence to confrontations. And here you see a picture of a Vietnam demonstration. And you got the old and the young, but it's predominantly the young. For the most part, the draft seemed to be unfair. It was supposed to pick the best man to be a soldier. But there were so many deferments. Like if you were studying to be a minister or a doctor or something like that, you could get a deferment. And if you were going to college, of course, you were usually the upper class white. So most of the new recruits that were going to the military were poor and or black. Some young men burned their draft cards in protest. Some young men traveled all the way to Canada to keep away from us because even though we have extradition with Canada, they weren't really likely to enforce it because they were against the Vietnam War also. So the students formed something called the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. And they did take a lot of stuff that they had learned from some of the other civil rights organizations. But these people were very proud to be a new left. And a lot of these members of the Democratic Society were former civil rights workers. There was another movement, one for free speech. They wanted a free university and a free society. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, except who's going to pay? And the Students for Democratic Society wanted education also. They wanted public health services. They wanted better job opportunities. They wanted reasonable housing, and they wanted no racial bias. Now, these are all worthwhile desires. I think we all want them. But somehow or another, they seem to forget somebody's got to pay for this. This new left, they wanted change. And the counterculture youth didn't really want change. They just wanted to, tune in, turn on, and drop out. And the older generation, of course, called them hippies or flower children. And in reality, they were consumers. They were buying things, but they weren't in the mainstream. And your text says they were exercising consumerism in a tie-dye T-shirt. Then you had the Woodstock Rock Festival in '69, and I did look through some YouTubes, and I decided since this was the last one, no, if you want to, there's some beautiful music and some of the really great groups of that time about Woodstock. All you got to do is go in and type Woodstock Festival on YouTube, and you come up with hundreds of them. But in this counterculture, and they were really a small group of them, they practiced the Eastern religions. They were social radicals, and they, of course, believed in LSD. And San Francisco Heights, the Ashbury district, was a mecca for hippies. And in 1967, before the Woodstock Festival, they had a Summer of Love. Make love, not war. Yeah, and most of these counterculture youth, discontented youth, however you want to call them, they weren't interested in politics. They just wanted personal freedom to do what they wanted to do when they wanted to do it. So what shaped this culture? Drugs. And of course, they studied the philosophers and music. Oh, we had some beautiful music come out of this time. The folk music had originally been the only one that criticized society in a very small audience. Because, like Elvis Presley and the Everly Brothers, they kept the music personal and you could understand the lyrics, and they weren't really complaining about anything except maybe an unsatisfied love affair. But then the Beatles arrived, and they got a lot of new groups like the Rolling Stones and the Who and the Grateful Dead. And you even got Bob Dylan, who was a folk singer, very critical of society. With all this music going on, you have communes that are formed primarily in upper New England and the Southwest. Now, some of them were really serious experiments. They lived off the land, but they also experimented in socialism and environmentalism, and they really tried. But in some of them, it was predominantly laying around doing nothing, taking drugs, and taking advantage of women. And you've got to realize also that as good as this looked, there was a very bad downside. Because with the drugs, especially LSD, there were bad trips, reoccurring trips. You could take it today and 2 weeks later have a reoccurring experience. Women were taken advantage of. There was a lot of sexual disease because they didn't use protection. Malnutrition because nobody was working. There was a very bad downside. But it's not just the youth that's dissatisfied, because women are not real happy with the roles that they've been assigned either, especially after the end of the war. Get back in the kitchen or the bedroom. There was an unequal opportunity in the job market. We knew this. And now the National Organization for Women were found because they were fighting for equal pay, equal opportunity, and equal responsibilities. And also there was a new contraceptive method that had just been approved by the FDA in the late 50s, early 60s called birth control pills. I know you can't imagine today when we've got dozens and dozens of ways to prevent a pregnancy out there. Sometimes you put the implant, sometimes you take a pill once every 3 months. There's all different kinds of things. But this was something new, because prior to this time, all we had was either the rhythm method or condom. But now we've got a pill we can take once a day. And it's great. So it almost caused a new sexual revolution. Because this new singles culture, because nobody was getting married, because that's what the establishment did. They accepted quite freely the sexual activity. Like I said, a lot of diseases going around. You got your drugs and everything else. And I honestly think that it was during this time that AIDS reared its ugly head, using dirty needles and everything else. Now, some of the women did become radical. Let's be honest about it. They protested the Miss American pageant, and they crowned a pig. And, of course, the burning of bras, which I think ought to be the law, a personal observation. And usually these women who were radical were former members of the civil rights and anti-war movement. They'd already knew what it was like to picket and to demonstrate. But feminism and sexism were words that we really weren't that familiar with before the 1960s. And it almost becomes a political movement in 1970 to 71. Now, I do agree with this. They fought against sexism, and they focused attention on rape. Because even now, when a woman reports a rape, she's the one that goes on trial. If she hadn't been there, if she hadn't worn those type of clothes, if she hadn't acted suggestively, she wouldn't have been raped. Now, this is a load of horse manure. I don't believe you should be able to walk into a bar naked and not have anything done about it. No, that's pushing it too far. But the right to say no, not to be forced. And of course, rape really isn't about sex. It's more about power than anything else. And they started fighting against the sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, I started to work back in the days when it was acceptable. And it was pretty rampant. But I've got that spelled totally wrong. It should be San Francisco. Becomes the Center for Gay Life. Now, it's hard for us to believe, but once upon a time, the policemen, they had their own little rules on the Great Blue Line, and they didn't like gays. seems that a gay man is a threat to the masculinity of any man that's around him. And they harass the gays badly. And there was an incident in New York in '69 called the Stonewall Rebellion where the gays were being harassed and they actually fought back. So the ideas began to change a little bit. Maybe we better not do this. And the gays and the lesbians came out. It seemed to be the thing. And a lot of them didn't come out voluntarily because there was an organization also that outed people who were gay who were maintaining a straight lifestyle. They began publishing newspapers, they built their own churches, and they even lobbied politicians. And they staged gay pride days and marches. And in 1974, which I find hilarious, the American Psychiatric Association actually took homosexuality off the list of mental disorders. But our cities are under stress. The populations are just growing like crazy, and of course when you have an increase in population, you've got to do something to your infrastructure. You needed new streets, you needed new schools, you need sewers, not to mention homes. And when you've got an overabundance of people and no place to put them, you get a reputation for being violent. But was all this caused by just growing pains? Was the cities growing by themselves? No. Massive migration of blacks from the South during the wars, and even whites coming up. And you began to form ghettos because, of course, we had those codes about where you could live. And the sad thing was the African Americans were not wanted in the South or needed anymore, and they sure as heck weren't wanted in the North because they're competition for labor union jobs. In most of the cities, I mean in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, the big cities, their infrastructure is 50 to 100 years old. And it's starting to fall apart. And I know from personal experience what a 100-year-old water system will do. Remember that problem I used to have down there on Frederick Street, down by the Kentucky Wesleyan? Where every time it rained, that street flooded. And I attended Kentucky Wesleyan, and there were several times my car flooded out in the parking lot. They had to rebuild that drain system, which was almost 100 years old. So the government began pumping millions into the industrial cities in the South and the West, where the great military complex type thing. And of course, developers build new homes and malls in suburbs. And the African Americans and Hispanics are rioting in the streets because there's no job opportunities or substandard housing. Anyone that could is moving to the suburbs, and the jobs are going there too. And by the end of all the rioting, more than 200 people were dead, mostly African Americans. And the big cities had huge scars from the devastation and destruction. It looked like a bomb had gone off. Of course, there was the Watts riot in August of '65, and there was looting and rioting and arson. And I don't understand what stealing a TV set has to do with complaining, but nevertheless, there were large cities that had riots, and they were all through the same problem. Lack of job opportunities, lack of housing. In 1966, there were rioters in Newark and Detroit and Chicago, and I think Detroit was the one that was the worst. And usually the target was symbols of white authority, white-owned stores or white-owned apartment houses. But our politicians, they did not want to admit there were any problems. Of course not. It was always the outside agitators, And of course they were so totally wrong because the people who were doing the rioting were the people who were living in the area. But it was the youth, not the older citizens. As your text points out, in spite of all the civil rights movement, we still have an awful high unemployment rate. We have racism, and we have the police treating the African Americans as if they were criminals or if they're potential criminals. And of course, Stokely Carmichael, in his Black Power statement, raising his fist, was very well received. So minorities try to define their heritage, and we have Black Power and Red Power and Brown Power. Of course, the Nation of Islam, Black Muslims, what they wanted was self-discipline, and it's kind of an offshoot. They're not practicing Islamic faith the way it was supposed to be. Now, self-discipline is good, but they wanted to support among themselves the black institutions, and a total rejection of anything, names, or anything else with anything white. And for those who saw no future in the integration system and nonviolence, it was a very good alternative. You could be somebody. Malcolm X, a.k.a. Malcolm Little, was a leading black Muslim speaker. And if you ever get a chance to read a biography of this man, do. It'll change your mind totally. He's emphasized the cultural heritage of the black people. He again emphasized economic self-help. He said, stop letting the whites judge you by your appearance and your communities. He was an extremist for black rights until he made those pilgrimages to Mecca. When he comes back, he leaves the Nation of Islam and he accepts whites. But because he left and he started his own organization, the members of the Nation of Islam assassinated him in February of 1965. The Black Panthers. Now, Bobby Steele and Huey Newton organized them. They had similar goals as the Nation of Islam, but they were militant. They would follow the police, and they had their police radios, and they'd follow them around, supposedly to eliminate the police mistreating a prisoner. And it was actually inhibiting. They carried weapons, but they did promote community self-help, which goes along with the Nation of Islam. But they also offered a free breakfast for school children. They helped build medical clinics, and they even ran political candidates for office. And unlike the rioters, the Black Panthers had a plan called the 10-point plan, which demanded not only full employment for the black men, but this is just number one, this is number 3 on their list. They want an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our blacks and oppressed communities. We believe that this racist government has robbed us, and now we are demanding the overdue debt of 40 acres and 2 mules. 40 acres and 2 mules were promised 100 years ago as restitution for slave labor and mass murder of black people. We will accept the payment in currency, which will be distributed to our many communities. The American races have taken part in the slaughter of our 50 million black people. Therefore, we feel this is a modest demand that we make. They also demand that businesses be turned over to them, and it's really quite a lengthy list. But they're demanding. But the Hispanics and the Native Americans are also protesting. In New Mexico, the Hispanics are demanding the return of their lands that were taken from them in a treaty. Cesar Chavez organized a multiracial United Farm Workers in '65, which was very good. He also believed in nonviolence, and he wanted social justice, better wages, and safer working conditions, and no more exposure to pesticides. Now, these are all totally reasonable, because there were no unions, and these people fell outside of protection of a lot of agencies. They were worked to death. They lived in horrible conditions. I've seen pictures of some of the places that were supplied to them to live in. I mean, you wouldn't put your dog in it. The Native Americans, they wanted to preserve their culture and their tribal institutions. They wanted economic improvements on the reservations, which were desperately needed. And in 1968, the Congress finally restored tribal law on the reservations, and they could have their own policemen. 1971, Alaska granted 44 million acres plus $963 million to settle claims from the Alaskan Indians. But the Indians wanted fishing rights in the Pacific Northwest, and the larger tribes wanted their own colleges. And to gain attention for their demands, the Indians sometimes went fishing where they weren't supposed to. They took over the abandoned prison Alcatraz, on that rock out there in the San Francisco Bay. And the Minneapolis Indians created what they called an American Indian movement to demand increased economic opportunity and a stop of police mistreatment. In 1973, they took over the village of Wounded Knee, which was the site of that horrible 1890 massacre, where so many men, women, and children were killed. Old men, women, and children were killed. They stayed 70 days and then left peacefully. But you see what each one of these have in common. They want economic opportunities. Not gimme some, well, the Black Panthers wanted to give me, but for the most part, most of them just want a chance to move ahead, a chance to have a decent job and a decent house. That's all they want. But meanwhile, suburbia is changing. Back in '45, right after the war, of course, suburbia was strictly a bedroom community. They were building houses for the returning military. But by 1970, more people are actually living in the suburban areas than in cities. And now this suburban area is what they call outer cities. You've got new jobs there. They've got economic clout. They're even gaining political representation. And whereas Brown v. Board of Education caused problems in the cities because they didn't want busing, a lot of families moved out of the cities, which into suburbia even more. And if they couldn't move out of the cities, they'd put their children in private schools. Meanwhile, white suburbia, because it is white, because the restrictions on buying homes is so rigid that the African American can't afford it. If they could afford it, they'd find some other reason to keep them out. So you have white suburbia, and they thought of themselves as having local control. They didn't have to answer to the county or the state. 1968, the Tet Offensive. And we begin asking, if the U.S. is winning the war, how did this happen? Well, the attack failed, and all areas that were taken were regained by the military, but the American public's beginning to question, because the network news and magazines are what's happening over there. We see pictures. You've got pictures of monks burning themselves to death. You see a picture of a child running down the street naked with her flesh burned off. And a very impressive picture of the execution of a captive in Saigon streets. The one on the left, of course, he's got his hands tied behind his back. And you see the picture, it looks god-awful. But there is a story behind the picture, because the man who's doing the shooting is a South Vietnamese officer, and the one on the right who's being executed is a Viet Cong informer who had just attacked the city. Execution like that, of course, is bad, no matter how you look at it, but you could understand in the throes of war how sometimes things get out of hand. Now, General Westmoreland, the gentleman in charge over there, requests 200,000 more military. But wiser heads advised LBJ that this war was totally unwinnable. The best thing to do was disengage. And since the public is turning against the war as a protest against LBJ's Vietnam policy, Senator McCarthy won the New Hampshire presidential primary. Oh my God, and he's Democratic. Robert Kennedy, a Democrat, threw his hat in the ring. So now you've got two Democratic contenders going against a sitting president. So, with political challenges in his own party and the Vietnam problems, LBJ finally announces the halt of bombing. And then he withdrew his name from the presidential race, which blew everybody's mind. At 6:01 p.m. on April the 4th, 1968, civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was hit by a sniper's bullet. He'd been standing on the balcony in front of a room in the motel in Memphis, and without warning, he was shot. James Earl Ray was the assassin. And of course, he was caught and arrested, but MLK had been in Memphis to support sanitation strike. But his assassination sparked fresh riots and arson all over the place, and they even called out the Army, not the National Guard, but the Army to guard the Capitol in Washington, because everybody was scared to death. What's going to happen? What's going to happen now? Just a couple of minutes later, June the 5th, 1968, presidential candidate Robert Kennedy was shot 3 times by a Palestinian immigrant called Sirhan Sirhan after the Kennedy had been given a speech at a hotel in Los Angeles. Because of that assassination, secret police finally are ordered to give all future major presidential candidates protection. But even though it was a crowd of people around, Sirhan managed to fire all 8 bullets before being subdued, and 6 people were hit. Not that it matters, but Sirhan was born in Jerusalem, and there was a trial, of course. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. But he was never executed because California had abolished the death penalty. Kennedy's death ensured Vice President Humphrey's nomination. And George Wallace is also running, appealing to Southern voters and those that are kind of discouraged with the way things are going. So they held the convention in Chicago, and Mayor Daley decided to use police against the anti-war demonstrators that showed up. And finally, the police ran into a mob on purpose of demonstrators, and clashed is the word your text uses, but I think it was more than a clash. It got so bad that the National Guard had to be called out to separate the two groups. And of course, it's all caught on television. So now the public is very angry with the Democrats. And Richard Nixon, the Republican, was elected. Yeah, I thought I'd open up, since you've all heard about Tricky Dicky, I'd open up with a couple of accomplishments. He did reduce the Cold War tensions. He upgraded civil rights enforcement, and he set goals for the in federal housing for minority hiring. He presided over environmental laws, and he opened talks with China. Now, he started his campaign. He said he had a secret plan to get us out of Vietnam. He didn't. But in March 1968, when the news media revealed hundreds of men, women, and children killed by U.S. soldiers in My Lai, things were bad. And there again, there's a story behind that. I'm not condoning it in any way, shape, or form. I just would like to explain it for just a minute. You take these young, corn-fed boys from the farm, from Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas, and you put them in a uniform, you give them a gun, you tell them to go there and kill people. Yeah, Americans have been taught, you don't kill women, you don't kill children. But the infiltrators, the Viet Cong, had no compulsion against using women and children, and they would put grenades on children and have them walk into a group of military men. And you could have someone who's been working for you, making your bed and helping you around as a house servant for months, and all of a sudden, she decides to blow you and her up. Women had where they would insert razor blades in certain areas of their body, and when they would go to have relations with a man, of course, it would slice his private parts to pieces. And they would have a wounded soldier laying on the ground, and you go to help him, and as you turn him over to help him, he would be booby-trapped. It was horrible. It was a guerrilla war like we've never heard of before. And of course, the young men, they're drugs, of course. But this particular campaign or particular group, they had been ambushed. They'd been given wrong information, had been ambushed by the Viet Cong and lost an awful lot of their men. And they'd been told that My Lai was the place that these men had come from. So they get there, and we do not know who fired the first shot. All we know is that they leveled the whole village. And after it was over with, it was discovered there was nothing but old men, women, and children there. Were they Viet Cong supporters? Probably. Were they the ones that sent the Viet Cong out? We'll never know. All we know is we saw the pictures of all those innocent men, women, and children who had been massacred by American soldiers. And of course, morale on the front lines, it's really hurting because of the racial tensions. And of course, we're not getting any support from the U.S. I mean, protesters by the millions are protesting in this country. And when you don't have the support of the people back home, you just might as well forget it. In October of '68, more than 2 million protesters were holding rallies against the war all over the country. And Nixon says that there's a silent majority for his policies. But he does begin to withdraw troops. And he uses the word Vietnamization, which means you turn the responsibility and everything over to the South Vietnam troops and bring your guys home. Well, it makes sense. They should be trained to defend their own country. But the Nixon doctrine changed from the Truman doctrine. Whereas the Truman doctrine said we would help any country that's being threatened by communist takeover, the Nixon doctrine said we'd continue to help any country with arms and money, but no military if they were threatened by the communists. No military. Sounds good to the public. And then he turns around and he has Cambodia invaded with the excuse it's going to cut off supplies to the Viet Cong. Well, of course, the public's outraged, and all they did was devastate the country and made it possible for the Khmer Rouge to take over and kill millions of their own people. But like I said, the public's outraged, and some students at Kent State protest. The National Guard is called in, and 4 students are killed. And just a month later, 2 students are killed by the National Guard at Jackson State University in Mississippi. Here again, I'm not condoning, but let me explain just a minute. You've got young men in the National Guard. You've got a crowd of hundreds or thousands of people who are throwing rocks, who are spitting on you, who are shoving you, who are actively disobeying orders, and you've got a very frightened young National Guardsman with a gun in his hand. And maybe I'm a coward, but I am not going to go against a guy with a gun if I don't have a gun. It was sad on both sides. It was horrible. It shouldn't have happened, but when you get a situation like that, it's very volatile. But meanwhile, Nixon sets up a new system for the draft. It's a lottery where you're going to be called up by your birth date. And Congress repeals the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave the president a blank check to do anything he wanted to. It also prohibited the use of any military outside of South Vietnam. In other words, we're not going to go into Cambodia anymore, and you really shouldn't go up to North Vietnam. Finally, there's a ceasefire, but it's on January 17, 1973. The U.S. is going to withdraw, and the Viet Cong will remain in control of Vietnam and in parts as a whole of South Vietnam. And we promised to not give any military aid to the South, but we did maintain relations in the South and tried to help them a little bit. And 2 years later, South Vietnam was invaded and, of course, crumbled immediately. Well, we had to evacuate the U.S. Embassy immediately by helicopter. And the sad thing is that there were so many South Vietnamese that helped the Americans. But they knew what would happen if the Viet Cong got hold of them, and they tried, and they overloaded helicopters, and it was just terrible, the evacuation. All caught on television. There was something good that happened. I mean, in July of '69, Neil Armstrong and Aldrin landed on the moon, and Nixon opens relation with China. And I hope you read that little piece about ping pong champions. They call it the ping pong conference. He goes to Moscow. He signs a strategic arms limitation treaty, or called SALT. So the French word détente, as it explains, it simply means an easing of tension. So things are kind of wrapping down a little bit. But Nixon wants to win re-election. So the best thing to do is to give the public something. So instead of giving the big cities something, he gives assistance for the suburbs. But meanwhile, the cost of living is rising, and there'd been an income tax in '69, which reduced the monies coming into the government, so we had less money to spend. There's a sharp increase in oil prices because of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries called OPEC. We still fight that today. Now, the United States is no longer top dog in the world economy. Germany and Japan's economy is growing gangbusters. So Nixon, he still wants to make nice with the public because the public's going to have to vote, right? Best thing to do is give them something. But we're becoming very environmentally conscious. So he creates the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce our environmental laws. Then he sponsors legislation on clean air and clean water and hazardous chemicals and endangered species and pesticides. And, well, in reality, we were becoming a lot more aware of the hazards created by man, the landfills and the waste disposal sites. For instance, in 1978, at your Tex mentions an entire neighborhood called Love Canal was contaminated by chemical dumping, and everyone had to move out. It's like I said, Nixon really, really wants to be reelected. And he thought he saw enemies everywhere because he's becoming a little bit paranoid. So he okayed some dirty tricks. And it begins with the Pentagon papers being leaked. Now, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had commissioned a study on how the heck did we wind up in Vietnam, and it also stated in there that even though the government was telling the public we're trying to get out, we were really didn't want to get out. We were increasing. And one of the guys who had contributed to the report leaked the news to the New York Times. Oh, mercy. Well, Nixon is really hot to trot over this. He says, no, no, no. He okays any use of a government agency like the IRS, the FBI, anybody to punish the journalist and any politician who opposes him. Now, two main plumbers, and they were called plumbers because their job was to stop leaks, called Hunt and Liddy, were special investigators. Now, Liddy went to work for the committee to re-elect the president, and I love the acronym, CREEP. And they wanted to undermine the confidence of the public and the Democrats. So the CREEP organization hired men to break into Democratic headquarters that were located in the Watergate building and see what their strategy was. Well, of course, they were caught. Now, Nixon should have tried to write it out, but he didn't. He decides on a cover-up and even offered a $400,000 bribe to the burglars. Meanwhile, campaign's still going on for this presidential election, and Senator McGovern was an opponent of the Vietnam War. Very nice man, but very low-key. But he wins the Democratic nomination. And George Wallace, somebody tried to kill him, and he wound up being paralyzed, so he's out of the race. But Nixon wins re-election in a landslide. Everything looks good, doesn't it? No, the cover-up's starting to unravel. You see, a federal judge had used a lot of pressure on one of the burglars by threatening to send him to prison for a long, long time and got him to talk. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reporters of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein start digging, and more dirty tricks are coming out. Now, Congress and the public want to know, what did Nixon know and when did he know it? Meanwhile, Vice President Spiro Agnew, that should be his name, not Agnes, it's Agnew, resigned in 1973 over charges of bribery and income tax evasion. And Senator Gerald Ford from Michigan was appointed to fill the position. It comes out that Nixon, well, actually Kennedy did it also, recorded everything that was said in the Oval Office. And of course, Congress demands to hear him, and he tries to stall everything he could. And when he was finally ordered to turn him over, he got mad, so he fired his attorney general and the special prosecutor, and your text calls it the Saturday Night Massacre. Well, when the tapes were finally turned over, there were passages missing. And he claimed his secretary had accidentally erased them. And I remember seeing a picture. They said, how could she possibly erase them? Because where she was sitting, she couldn't reach the recorder. And she would show how she would leaned over and accidentally touched it, but nobody really believed it. So impeachment proceedings are beginning. Well, it's obvious that he's going to be impeached and probably brought up on charges, so he delivers the tapes. That on August the 8th, 1974, he resigns. First time we had a president resign. And with the president resigning, the vice president, Gerald Ford, becomes president. And of course, his first order of business is to pardon Nixon for any and all crimes he committed while president. And of course, there were rumors that was there a deal made somewhere along the line. I don't know. I don't know how there could have been a deal because he was appointed vice president before this whole thing happened. But, you know, conspiracy theorists always got a conspiracy somewhere. Now, Ford actually beat Ronald Reagan for running for the nomination for president in '76. But the general public has had their fill of the Republican tricks and what all's going on, and so they voted Democratic. Now, they'd had a president who's resigned because he was lying and he was paranoid. Before that, we had a president who got us in a war we think that was bad. I mean, you've got the counterculture going on, and the whole country's just fed up with the way things are, so in our usual way, we change parties. And the man they picked was former governor of Georgia, a former naval officer, James Earl Carter Jr. Very unlikely man. We got what we asked for, a decent, non-corrupt, religious man. Very politically naive. But he did have some good qualities. He wanted better schools and economic growth for blacks and whites. But unfortunately, when he came in, he was coming under the cloud of the Watergate scandal, a very combative press, opaque, Islamic fundamentalists, and a very, very self-satisfied Congress. They just got rid of a president. And about that same time, the economy goes into another depression. Oil prices skyrocket. Interest rates surge. Unemployment gets worse. And President Carter asked the public to conserve on energy. And we did. I remember turning off all the lights except the one we had to have. And as soon as we did that, about 2 months later, the prices of the electric and gas go up because we're using less. Damned if you do and damned if you don't. So he begins to propose alternative energy sources, and one of the things he came up with was atomic energy. Well, the anti-nuclear movement that was going on did not trust the Atomic Energy Commission in their disposal plans for spent rods. And then there was a near-nuclear meltdown at a place called 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. And as a result of that, the efforts to expand nuclear power came to a screeching halt. And while all this is going on, technology has increased by leaps and bounds and has caused the collapse of a lot of factories in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Indiana. As a matter of fact, they were starting to be called that region where all the factories were closed, the Rust Belt. Now, don't you love that word, deindustrialization? Well, when you close factories, your tax revenues fall because you've got unemployment. All the high-paying jobs go somewhere else, and if you've got less money coming in, your infrastructure begins to erode. And because of the way they were doing things, the American steel market, which had been booming for a while, it's too expensive to export. They won't buy it. But there is a little sunlight. I mean, there was expanded markets in the farm produce because the foreign crops there'd been a crop failure in the foreign countries. And yes, it only lasted 7 years, but during that 7 years, the banks loved it, the crops increased, people bought new equipment, and some of those tractors cost $200,000. And when the boom was over, the farmers found they had debts they could not pay, similar to the 1920s. So we have some people who sell their farms because they can't afford to keep them. We have others who sell them because they're just tired of the whole business, and farms by the hundreds disappear. But the large-scale agribusiness becomes a reality. I remember when I was living out there on, what road did I live on? Winkler. I lived on Winkler Road. Sometimes I would see these big green tractors go by, 2 miles of them. It would be one of the big farms out there going in mass, and they would take care of a field by plowing it and planting it and everything else just in one afternoon. They've got so many people to work. But let's look at some of Carter's achievements. He had no objection to working with the African, the Asian, and the Latin American nations, trying to make nice. He even appointed Andrew Young, an African American, as an ambassador to the United Nations, who did great things. He even convinced the Senate to transfer the control of the Panama Canal to Panama, which eased a lot of tensions. He began criticizing the Soviet Union for denying citizens civil rights. He withheld aid to South Africa, Guatemala, and Chile, and Nicaragua because of human rights abuses. He managed to get Egypt and Israel leaders to talk, and they came to Washington and went out to Camp David, and they actually began to normalize relations between the two countries, and it's called the Camp David Agreement. His failures? Well, Soviets are ignoring human rights. Soviet advisors and or Cuban troops are intervening in the African wars. Any hopes for assault II are gone. And then Soviet troops enter Afghanistan. And we should have taken a lesson from them in this, don't you think? It was like quicksand. It was like their Vietnam. And where are we now? Now, the Shah of Iran had actually modernized the economy, but had the hated, dreadful secret police. I mean, they had a building where they would take their citizens and do all kinds of terrible things to them. But there was a revolution that took down the Shah at the beginning of 1979. And the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, which was a Muslim cleric, hated the U.S. He wasn't in charge of the government, but being the strongest religious leader, he did influence the government. Now, we did maintain relations, but they were very, very shaky. And finally, the Shah requested permission to enter the U.S. for medical treatment. And this was more than the Ayatollah could take. A mob storms the U.S. Embassy in Tehran on March the 4th, 1979, and more than 60 Americans were taken hostage. The Khomeini demands the United States turn over the Shah in exchange for the hostages. And we said, no, we don't do that type of business. And we tried economic pressure, we tried diplomacy, nothing seemed to help. Because, see, the hostages are still in the embassy, in control of the militants. The government has got nothing to say about it. So Carter orders a rescue attempt, and it failed miserably. Number one, there was no coordination between the branches of service. Number two, it was too far from any type of help. But an agreement between the, shall we say, militants and the U.S. government was finally reached on the eve of the 1980 presidential election. However, the hostages were not released until Ronald Reagan took the oath of office. So for 444 days they were held. Now, there again, conspiracy theorists say that since this agreement was reached before Reagan was elected, that had it come out that Carter's administration had managed to release them, he might have won re-election, but Reagan gets the credit. But in reality, the deal had been made before he was ever elected, and they held on until he actually took the oath of office. And as well, you know, we have the election in November, and they don't take the office for another couple of months. Now, your text points out that what had happened in Iran was started way back in the 1950s in our Cold War strategy of endorsing any government that was anti-communistic. And, of course, Iran and the Shah were anti-communist, but we seem to not look at the type of government he had. It was very despotic. It was bad. So thus we come to the end of our journey through American history. And I do so hope that you've learned something about our past and how the United States has made some really big mistakes. But it seems we always do it with the intention of trying to do something that was good and right. So I request that you have faith in your country and support her. But don't be afraid to complain if something is wrong. Just do it peacefully. And don't forget to vote. That's the main way you tell your government you are happy or not. Also, a gentle reminder, you cannot access your final tests unless you have completed the instructor's evaluation. So I do wish each and every one of you success in your future academic career, and I've enjoyed this class. Thank you for listening.